Hi there, my name's Thomas Page, and I run an organization called the Transgender Rights Movement. Recently, we've been hearing a lot in the country a pretty strong debate regarding public restrooms and the transgender community. One of the things that we're not seeing as much is the trans man side of the conversation. I don't like to call it an argument. I'd rather we discuss things and work them out as a full community, an American community, than try and have these small debates that are about moral and religious issues and things like that. My organization is not a religious organization, and we're not a political organization. So we're not out in the streets fighting to change laws as much as we are for acceptance and for education and to build a stronger community for the transgender community themselves. That said, there are certain things that strongly affect us that we would like to address. One of the issues that is very pervasive is the concept of allowing people who were born biologically male, who identify as female, to be allowed to go into women's restrooms. I think that this is very, very important for us to address, but it's also important for us to address it not just focusing on trans women, but also focusing on trans men. I am a transgender male. I was born biologically female. I'm 34 years old. I started my transition when I was 20. Back when I was not on hormones yet, I've been on hormones for 12 years, I was going into the women's restroom. And when I entered college, I very quickly cut my hair. I grew up in a small farm town where being gay or lesbian was not acceptable, and being trans was unheard of, and most people, including myself, didn't even know what the term meant. So, when I got into college, I cut my hair. I started going by my middle name, which is Chase, which could be a man's name or a woman's name. And I started to identify more and more as male, which aligned with what I understood myself to be. I found that other people were very quickly picking up on that concept about me and also being accepting of it, sometimes more accepting than I was ready for. I have a couple of stories I'd like to tell you about my experiences with bathrooms, and so that you can get a little bit of a different perspective than what's being heard out there right now. It seems a lot of the times that the debates that happen about trans people, and whether it be about our rights or about our comfort level in society, these things come from the perspective of others looking in rather than hearing community members actually share their own experiences, which I think that if you heard a little bit more about what we have to say about our experiences with public restrooms, you might have a little bit different of an opinion regarding the whole situation. I know that for me, when I was in transition, I actually felt more comfortable going into the women's restroom. Back in the early 2000s, when I was transitioning, we were still in a space where it felt very dangerous, and most of the literature and books that were out there, books like Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg, made trans men pretty scared to be in any spaces that were male-dominated, including the restroom. So at that time, I was still going into the female restroom. I was very uncomfortable going into any kind of male restroom. It was a space that I was frightened of. And I remember I was in marching band, and I was about 20 years old, and it was right before I started transitioning. And I went into the women's restroom. It was during band camp, and my roommate at the time was female, and we were best friends. And she didn't go into the bathroom with me, and another young woman who was a freshman on campus, who thought that I was male anyway, walked into the bathroom, saw me brushing my teeth in there, and ran out screaming, "There's a boy in the girls' bathroom!" And the feeling that I had standing in there holding my toothbrush was, oh no, everybody's going to know now that, first of all, that I'm transgender, because I try to go into the bathrooms when nobody else is in there, and I still do that. Um, and that either they're going to know I'm transgender or they're going to think that I'm a man and that I'm being creepy in the female restroom. So I had to go through that whole process. It was interesting. I ended up becoming friends with this young woman later. But that moment of fear and freezing, it was very difficult for me. And it made for, a lot of reservations. And it actually was one of the things that started to push me to go into the men's restroom when I started to realize I was making women uncomfortable in the women's restroom. So this is something that people don't really take into consideration a lot of the time. Another thing that I've experienced in the men's restroom is I work in an industry where I have to dress like this a lot, in a suit and tie. I work in live sound, and I work with a lot of men. And going into a men's restroom for me is very difficult when I have to go in with coworkers. Often we only get 1 or 2 breaks during a long day of work. It's very heavy work, and everyone has to, very quickly get in and out of there and take the break that they are allowed. But I find myself not going to the restroom when the rest of my coworkers are going in there, partially because I don't use a urinal. I have to use the stall, so I stand there and wait for the stall while everybody else is using the urinal. Or once I'm in the stall and I realize that you can see the feet of the person next to you, I realize that they notice, maybe at least, it's always a fear in my mind that people notice that my feet are turned in the wrong direction, and just little things like that. The one thing that I'm grateful for in men's restrooms is men go into the restroom pretty much to do their business and leave. So there's not necessarily a huge fear of being social like there is in the women's restroom, where women are working on their makeup, they're having conversations, they're much more social in the restroom than men are. So there's a difference here, right, in the ways that we interact in these spaces. For me, it's easy to go into a men's restroom and come out very quickly, as opposed to, for a trans woman going into a women's restroom, there's another entire set of social factors that come into play. Now, if you take my experience into consideration and you apply that to a trans woman, whether she's in transition or pre-transition, or she has been on hormones like I have for over 10 years, she's facing the same level of fear. If you ask a trans woman to go into a men's restroom, you immediately put her at risk for violence, because there's not even a question at this point as to whether she's transgender or not. And we're not talking about men who enjoy dressing in women's clothing and performing in drag and things like that. That is not what this community is. Someone who needs to use a woman's restroom, who was born biologically male, does so because this is how they are all of the time. They don't get in and out of costume at the end of the day like somebody who's performing. This is something that, unfortunately, people don't realize. And we have this term called tranny that people use. Unfortunately, some popular television programs have taken a term that actually transgender people used to call each other, and they've made it into something bad or negative. And it's mostly been applied to trans women, and it's mostly been applied to trans women who are forced to work out in the streets. It's very sad that, there are a lot of words out there that people have from a dominant group taken and applied to a minority group, and sometimes the minority group is able to actually reclaim that word and use it amongst themselves in their community. This is actually opposite for the trans community. Back in the early 2000s, when I was transitioning, and right around the time that I was, trans men used to call each other tranny boys. It meant that you were a young man who was in transition or pre-transition, basically in the male puberty phase, right? So it was just kind of an endearing term that we used that then became something that was applied because of the drag community using it on one another to describe one another as not effeminate enough, which I just think is very sad. And then the larger community, because of media and television shows that use the term in a negative sense, adopting it and applying it to other people, it's become something that's now not okay for us to call each other or okay to use anymore. How does this apply to the bathroom situation? Well, the thing is here, if you ask everyone, or you demand or make laws that everyone go into the bathroom that aligns with not only their gender that they were assigned at birth, but specifically at their physical parts, then you're creating actually a completely different problem. If you create a law that says that if you were born biologically female, you have to go into a female bathroom, you've created a space where now I have to go into a woman's room. And I'd like people to take a moment and ask themselves, which would make them more uncomfortable? Would you be more comfortable having a transgender woman who is dressed like a woman, who wears makeup, who presents as a woman, and chances are, based on the way that they were raised, which was male, to get in and out of the bathroom pretty quickly, and having the fear that you'll even notice that they're not biologically female in the first place, do you think that that person would make you more uncomfortable than, say, someone like me with a beard, who looks male, presents as male, who's dressed in a suit and tie, would make you uncomfortable walking into a woman's restroom? After all, women with young children, have this fear that, well, I'm going to have to tell my son or daughter that this different person is in the restroom. Do you think that it would be more likely for your child to be questioning the concept of being in the wrong restroom if I were to walk into the restroom, or another trans man who looked very masculine, or if another woman who maybe just looks a little different walked into the restroom? This becomes actually not just a question of being transgender or what your what your parts are. It becomes a question really of what you look like. If I look like a man, I can walk into a men's restroom and not be questioned. If a transgender woman walks into a woman's room, and because of the fact that male hormones going through male puberty as a child, which most trans women at this point in time have gone through because of the fact that this is something that has been evolving over time, male hormones are much rougher on the body, and it's much more difficult to go from looking masculine to looking feminine than it is to go from looking feminine to looking masculine. So it's easy for me to go into a men's restroom, and for a lot of my peers to go into a men's restroom and nobody questions us. But the fact that a trans woman doesn't look as feminine or as female as us male counterparts are able to blend in as males, it makes a problem for them that shouldn't be there. And the problem is only based on how you look. So then you have to start asking yourself, would I discriminate against someone because of how much they weighed, or how tall they were, or whether they were disabled, or the color of their skin coming into my bathroom that I call mine? Would you say that someone speaks a different language than yourself, so therefore, they don't belong in the same space as you? And when you get down to those little pieces and you realize that you're just discriminating against someone based on the way that they look and not on the way that they're behaving, you realize that you are being extremely discriminatory in a lot of ways, and in cruel ways. The way that someone looks is not something that they can change any more than the way that someone is born as regarding any other demographic can be changed. So these are things to take into consideration when we're looking at a debate regarding not just the rights of people who feel that they're being impeded by somebody getting into their space and feeling that they're dealing with a predatory population, but realizing what those other folks are going through at the same time. I would like to encourage my other transgender community members, both trans men and trans women, to send in videos to this organization and talk to us about your experiences in the bathroom. Tell us how uncomfortable you are going into either bathroom. I can tell you that there is no public restroom that I feel comfortable in at any time unless it's a single person restroom and I know nobody else is going to be in there. And even then, I say to myself, oh, coming out of that restroom, people are probably going to wonder why I went in there. So these are things that we don't take into consideration when we put these laws on the table and we debate these things. And it would be wonderful if we actually took a little time to do so. Thanks very much for hearing what I had to say here today, and I really hope that, like I said, some of us will be able to share more of our stories, and we can talk a little bit more about this on a personal level rather than making it something that is totally a political issue that is really just being fought for the sake of fighting. Thanks very much for your time. I appreciate it. Have a wonderful weekend.